filter. There we go. Right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Airmic Fast Track workshop. My name is Alex Frost. I'm the Market Development Manager at Airmic, and I will be moderating today's discussion. The topic for today's workshop is employee well-being in an evolving workplace. And we are extremely fortunate this morning to be joined by three of our industry peers from Zurich. First off, we have Ruth Taylor, who is the Senior Medical Rehabilitation Consultant for Zurich Corporate Risk, who started her career as a social worker with families and then qualified as a mental health nurse. We have Rob Brown, who is Director of Customer and Distribution Management for the UK and the Asia and Pacific region. Rob has 17 years of experience in the life insurance industry across Europe and APAC, and deep expertise in employee benefits. And finally, Dennis Cronston, who is the Chief Sales and Distribution Officer of Zurich LiveWell, which is the newly created unit within Zurich Insurance focusing on digital health and well-being innovation for this sector and its clients. So eminently qualified to speak on this morning's subject, all of our panel. I think for me, it's become something of a truism that there will be a long-term health, both mental and physical effects from the pandemic and from the way that we have been living and working. But I think that it is going to be something that companies in our industry will be grappling with, and many industries, for some time to come. And so what we are going to hopefully be taking away from today is understanding the market trends in this field and their impact on employee well-being, translating what these trends can mean for risk managers and potential solutions to help manage and mitigate these risks, and to identify how risk managers can work with their business to mitigate these and reduce, or rather the risks associated, to reduce issues of employee well-being and the associated costs. So with that, I will hand over to Dennis and ask him to take it away.
Thank you very much indeed. It's much appreciated, and it's an absolute pleasure to spend a little bit of time with everybody today and give you a perspective on our world, the impact of recent trends and more long-term trends in the world of corporate health and well-being, and really just to engage into the drivers behind that and the implications for employers globally. So when we look at the landscape of corporate health and well-being, we really identify three important trends which are driving the health and wellness outcomes and the technology outcomes in this space. The first one obviously is the new normal, or the next normal, which we find ourselves in at the moment, and this is the incredibly disruptive and intrusive time of the pandemic into the world of work. The lines between work and life, home and personal and work are all being blurred into a continuum, and it really is becoming and will continue to be a challenging scenario for employers for the foreseeable future. What it has thrown up, very importantly though, is an accelerated uptake of the adoption of health technology. Many of you will probably easily understand that in the way in which things like telemedicine are being rapidly implemented in many organizations as risk countermeasures. But more broadly, just the general application of health technology in terms of remote biometric surveillance and other types of health engagement are really coming to the fore as key drivers. In the center, we're really emphasizing the connection that organizations are making between the health of employees and their intrinsic performance, strategic execution, competitive capabilities, the ability literally of organizations to exist and flourish in this new era is really directly related to the aggregate health of their employee base. And so in some ways it's very gratifying to see this connection. In other ways it's long overdue. The fact that cognitive performance and emotional performance doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it really is dependent on a strong physical platform. The final element which is driving impacts in terms of corporate health and well-being is simply the very poor state of health of populations around the world, large populations. We know, and you'll please forgive me if this is a statistic which you've discussed before, but we know from recently released research that only about 12% of the US population, which is probably generalizable to large proportions of other geographies as well, only about 12% of the US population is metabolically healthy. What that means is that only 12% of the population has no evidence of things like high blood pressure, abnormal blood lipids, diabetes, or poor body composition. And not only does this make them vulnerable to the impact of pandemic influences, but it also reduces their ability to be optimally productive in the workplace, and for that matter, contribute to the strategic workload of an organization. So moving to the next insight, what we are able to identify when we focus specifically on metabolic illness is that, paradoxically, the diseases of lifestyle are increasing. And here you can see the lifestyle-related chronic illnesses in the dark blocks, as we've represented them by terms like high blood pressure, hypertension, coronary heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and mental disorders, are all being driven by lifestyle-related conditions. And to a far lesser extent, the kind of native chronic illnesses like kidney disease, cancers, obstructive pulmonary or obstructive airways disease, and asthma in a much lower order of magnitude. In fact, when we move and look at a focus on obesity and diabetes, we really do see quite a catastrophic capitulation of large proportions of the population to these drivers of metabolic ill health. Obesity and diabetes are really markers for kind of a clinical term called insulin resistance, but nonetheless, they are indicators that the aggregate health of populations across the world, and particularly the employed population, the adult population, are succumbing to these negative influences, and by quite dramatic percentages in population terms. And in fact, it is incredibly challenging or meaningful or terrifying that an anticipated 30% or more of adults in the huge population in the United States will have diabetes, full-blown diabetes, not to mention pre-diabetes and other metabolic illnesses in the next 30 years. So a massive, massive challenge in terms of population health management going forward. So that's metabolic illness on the one side of the coin. And in the next slide, we focus on the other side of the coin, which is the area of mental illness. We've used a snapshot of mental disorder prevalence in the United Kingdom, but again, through our evaluation of this, it is very much generalizable to large proportions of populations worldwide. The massive increase in mental disorder prevalence. We thought it was also interesting to put in to the slide the Gallup survey on negative experiences. And it does sound a little bit, maybe to the uninformed, a little bit kind of counterintuitive that negative experiences should be so important, but they really do indicate an important element of mental well-being. It speaks about physical manifestations of a life and experience. It speaks about stress, it speaks about losing appetite, it speaks about fatigue and exhaustion. So this negative experience index, as you can see, which is a consistent survey done year after year for a large number of years now, really is showing a continuous decline, and the prevalence of negative experiences really representing a good barometer of mental illness or mental illness potential on a continuing basis. And really the age of anger is being thrown around quite appropriately, one would say, as a representation of these negative experiences in mental health. In the next slide, we really take stock of that from a commercial perspective, and you can see two views of that in the slide. On the one side, you see the absolute measure of healthcare costs rising over the last 50 years and doubling during that period. On the right-hand side, the proportion of healthcare costs which are above inflation in many geographies all over the world. And if we step back from these two representations, we really do start to understand that as nations and as organizations, the challenges of managing the increasing and continuously evolving costs of health management are becoming a very significant challenge. I think point made. And so why is this really happening? We've spoken about metabolic illness, but really if we take stock of the high level influences of these specific cost increases, paradoxically, the aging population is driving a lot of those costs. And it's not so much that it's just an aging population, it's that the aging population is not aging well. You heard me speak about a 12% rate of metabolic health in the American population. If we look at the 65-year-olds and over in that population, unfortunately, that figure drops to about 2.5%. So only about 2.5% of 65-year-olds and over in the US population are actually metabolically healthy. In addition to that, as we've covered a little bit now already, the increase in lifestyle-related chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, outcomes like stroke, and others really are the outcome of poor health, population health management, in particular nutrition, but also elements of activity, exercise, and other habits. And finally, a huge driver of mental illness, a huge driver of healthcare costs is mental illness. And it's true to say that although the COVID-19 pandemic has amplified and focused attention on many of these drivers of health, they were very much pre-existing for a long period of time. And what we're seeing now is really just an emphasis of these in the context of COVID-19. And our final two slides from my side just represents the pandemic context. On the first one of these, mental health, from an organizational perspective, we see a 48% increase in the impairment of workplace performance by mental health issues. Focusing specifically on stress, we see the broad base of that impact. The broad base being the increase in stress driven by partner-spouse issues, anxiety disorders, financial distress, the failure of accommodation in workload, and from all of those contributors, a decline in the meaning of work and the self-actualization through work. So mental health really being dramatically impaired through the impact of the pandemic. And finally, the physical context. And we're just going to look at two areas of this. Firstly, the area of activity. And while it's not necessarily unexpected, the extent to which physical activity has declined is really quite striking. What we're seeing over here is that during the pandemic, and that's for the last 9 months almost, a dramatic reduction in the appropriately active from just over 37% to under 11%, and the corresponding increase in only the moderately active and the inactive individuals more broadly. So despite the fact that there are opportunities for individuals to be active, they really have declined on aggregate pretty much universally. And from a nutrition perspective, as you would expect, even though the pandemic phase has emphasized the importance of effective nutrition, we actually see the adoption of relatively poor food choices over this period. A lot of highly refined carbohydrate intake, saturated trans fats specifically, and industrial seed oils, at the expense of whole foods like meat, fish, and other products. So it just really is important to note that the pandemic phase has really dragged global populations back significantly and thrust to the fore the vulnerability of organizations in this space. So I hope that gives you a logical context of health and well-being drivers and sets the scene for some of the specific impacts which my colleagues will speak about now.
Thank you, Dennis, for that. That is really helpful. Good morning, everybody.
Ruth, I think we've lost you. Are you on mute?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you. Thank you.
You can hear me. Okay, sorry about that. So I don't know quite where we got to, but just to say that I'm working in a much more local area. Obviously, I work for Zurich, and the employees and the employers that we come across are very much up and down all of the UK. So a little bit more closer to home than what Dennis was talking about, but it's also very relevant in the sense that what we're seeing in terms of the rehabilitation services is very reflecting what the national picture shows. So although at the moment there is little change in the data in terms of vacancies, we know that such events like this, the pandemic, there is a period of filtering time. So we would expect to see things change as time moves on and things settle down. We do predict an increase in requests for support, and it's believed that due to the uncertainty, occupational uncertainty, family uncertainty, health uncertainty, we're likely to see many more referrals come in for seeking assistance. We recognise that what we are also hearing is things such as isolation and the challenges that brings with it. Particularly, people are having to experiment working from home. That could be under the stairs, from their bedroom, from all sorts of different environments. And what we're hearing is that that type of working is causing an element of stress that we've not really seen before. And the stress is not just physical in terms of posture and things like that. It is about health from a mental health perspective. So what we're seeing generally across this picture is an increase in stress. Now, we know that stress in itself is not a psychiatric illness, but it can be a precursor, and it can often be a precursor to things like anxiety and depression, which is obviously very significant. And if we look at the next slide, we can just see a few statistics pop up here, which is really from the Office of National Statistics. It's showing there that since the pandemic, 64% of UK adults have felt worried about the future. It's probably higher than that now in terms of October, especially as we move from one wave into another in terms of lockdowns. And unfortunately, the cancer research has undertaken studies which have highlighted the fact that people are not being able to access the treatments that they were hoping to access, or even people are not approaching their GPs in the same way that they would normally in terms of registering suspicious symptoms. So this is quite a tragic event in the sense that what we will see, most definitely, and I think Dennis very well articulated that, is a potential increase in some of these significant physical and psychiatric illnesses. Okay, if we have a look at the next slide, thank you. Coming, yeah. So just having a quick look at the psychological trends that we're seeing an increase in, and obviously free-floating anxiety. So this is basically where individuals may have one or two worries about life in general. It might be about their family, it might be about their personal health, it might be about their occupation, and it might also be about world affairs. What we're hearing and what we're seeing is people talking more and more about the anxieties that they're feeling on a day-to-day basis. And obviously, as we all know, that you can manage anxiety. Anxiety in itself is normal. It's what gives us a sense of drive, energy, and the motivation that we need to do something. But when it becomes to the point that it feels overwhelming, then it does become a problem. And then we see things tipping over into things like work-related stress. So work-related stress is high on our agenda in terms of trying to support both employers and employees in managing this very difficult time. So the changes, things like expectations in role or organisational uncertainty, or even the way that people are working in terms of, as I said before, this remote way of working that an awful lot of people are having to do, is finding its way into people's stress levels, which is causing a rise, which then obviously, if we're not careful, tips over into things like depression. And obviously that depression is reactionary as opposed to biochemical. So it also reflects the fact that people are experiencing the challenges of social tension, personal relationships. We can't forget things like cultural, people being displaced, not being able to go home, not being able to visit family and friends. And also things like intergenerational living is having an impact in terms of how people are operating on a social level. And for some people, they're not operating at all on a social level. And that obviously then leads to things like loneliness and isolation. So it's a big problem, and we are, there is a, I guess on the positive side of all of this, if there is a positive side, there is a sense of camaraderie where people are recognizing that they're not the only person in the situation. To some extent, that is what we are looking at in terms of trends in relation to physical health. Well, I've already sort of touched about posture in terms of the way that people are working, but we're seeing more people talking about things like neck pain, shoulder pain, wrist pain, and that working off conducive to the way in remote working should be. And I think I have to say that organisations up and down the country have done a tremendous job in trying to facilitate the whole process of enabling people to work from home. And they've done a really good job. But nevertheless, we are seeing people who are experiencing a number of negative symptoms by the way that their, desk height isn't right, lighting isn't right, etc., etc. Okay, and things like the mentioned before, but scans, reviews, clinical reviews, chemo, radiotherapy, that has meant a delay for some people, and it depends on where you are in the country as to what the length of that delay will be. But obviously that leads to an increased sense of anxiety and more health vulnerabilities from a physical perspective. And then what we weren't seeing before is people with sort of coexisting conditions. So we might have seen previously people who have cancer, and obviously the anxieties that go with having a diagnosis such as cancer in terms of the general anxieties. But now these people are also presenting with psychological problems, worrying about whether their treatment is going to be timely, whether it's going to be consistent, and whether it's going to be effective. So people are beginning to voice these concerns and obviously feeling a sense of hopelessness and helplessness about what they can do about it. And as I've mentioned before, there are a group of people who are actually delaying seeking advice or even not seeking advice at all. So that's actually a fairly big problem that we're trying to tackle in terms of assisting people. And on the next slide, if we could move to the next slide. So what are we doing? Well, as I said before, I'm talking from a local perspective. So this is what rehabilitation services are trying to do to support our colleagues, our clients. So this is employers and employees. The biggest thing obviously is collaboration in terms of working. So we need to understand what the problems are. We need to facilitate an action plan, and that might be for presenteeism. So that might be where people are at work but are struggling. So our aim is to keep people at work whilst supporting and boosting their personal coping mechanisms and strategies to enable them to self-help. We're also looking at signposting. Now, obviously, it's no good signposting people to services that aren't receptive or that have no operational value at the moment. So we're trying to be creative in looking at, is there anything from a self-help perspective that we haven't explored before? If people actually do need clinical signposting, and we do feel that there is a struggle there for them to be able to get what they need, then we will be trying to step in to enable them to develop the assertion that they need to be able to challenge so that they do get the treatment or the assessments. And obviously what is really important are things like risk assessment and relapse prevention. So if people do dip into anxiety and depression, they do have absence, we try and get them back to work on a supported return to work plan, collaborating all the time with the treating clinicians, as well as themselves and their employers. And then the education is obviously really important, and it's very powerful. I think those people who are informed feel more able to cope. So we do a lot of work in terms of education, and things like webinars and podcasts and handouts and things like that are very, very important. We also encourage people to help themselves as well as looking at the professional services. So in terms of, you know, what can we do that we're not doing? Well, we realise that in the future there's a big pathway to travel. It's very much undetermined at the moment. So we are looking to see how we can improve our dialogue with people like GPs and specialists, try to get a better understanding of how they're operating, so that when we work with our local clients, we are in tune with what's going on nationally. Okay, thank you. I think there might be one more slide. Yeah, there we go. So the bottom line is that in this situation of this pandemic and all the effects that it has, is the responsibility for the solutions belong to everybody. It's not one size fits all, and there are some positive things, as the bottom bar there shows. The Couch to 5K has been a real boost, and people are keen to help themselves. They are motivated. They do want to do the right thing. They don't want to burden the NHS. So people are taking an own interest in their health. So there is some good news where we can direct and signpost people to, and there are obviously more coming their way. Unfortunately, at the NHS, the launching of the long COVID specialist clinics is yet to really get off the ground. And I think that's because at the moment we're still very much in the midst of the pandemic itself. So the resources are very much focused to treating people in that situation. So there is a recognition from the NHS England that this needs to get going, and get going as soon as possible. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. So hi, my name is Rob Brown, and as I said at the beginning, my focus is really on the global insurable employee benefits side of the discussion today. So we've heard from Dennis and Ruth about a number of the market trends and how they're affecting employee well-being. What we wanted to do is spend a few minutes before we wrap up talking about the so what in terms of helping to quantify the tangible financial impact of employee well-being on a business, and how using your skill set as a current or future risk manager in your organizations, you can help to address some of the root causes of the significant issues we're being discussed today. Considering the audience and being based in, most of you being based in the UK, we are using UK examples today. I think you've probably noticed some of that, but I think it was important that we wanted to acknowledge that whilst these are UK examples, clearly what we're going through at the moment is pretty global in nature, and they would be similarly applicable at a global level for those of you that work in multinational organizations and have global remit. So I guess the first thing to note importantly is that employee well-being is directly linked to employee engagement and employee productivity. Importantly, productivity is then linked to profitability, and we know that now there's a trend that analysts, stockholders, share brokers are considering employee engagement as a strong proxy for future business success. And it makes sense, right? So if you've got employees that are happy and engaged, they're likely to put in more discretionary effort, which increases productivity, reduces business expenses, and allows businesses to benefit from, I guess, a higher yield from employees, if you want to look at it in a brutal sense. So that it allows them not to hire more people to do the same work, right? So it's linked to profitability. And as I said, I think this is being measured now by analysts, and will become, therefore, on the radar of CFOs a lot more in the future. So there's a real sort of tangible impact to some of the things we're talking about so far. The second point is more, I guess, micro than that macro view. So that's around, you know, how employees are engaged and the impact on insurable employee benefits, and that's one of the things that we can control. And I guess as risk managers, going back to your day job, it's something that you might have some exposure to in terms of insurances and, you know, workers' compensation, employers' liability, that sort of stuff. And there is this I guess, discretionary employee benefits side of the world that is impacting financially on organisations. So I just wanted to talk about that for a few minutes so that we understand the reasons why these kind of products are provided. So insurable employee benefits, ultimately, employee benefits are there to attract, retain and reward employees. They range from, you know, your pension, car allowance, apps, employee discounts, and then also include what we're talking about today, or a little bit today, around insurable employee benefits such as life insurance, income protection, disability, critical illness, and importantly, because it tends to be about 80% of a non-pension spend from employers, is medical or health insurance, and we've talked a little bit about that already. So from a global company perspective, they'll be provided, you know, differently depending on things in countries like the social security system or the public health system in each country, and employee benefits are there to, I guess, supplement what's provided locally, and also to try to, I guess, compete with peers of insurers. So for instance, like Google will try to provide better benefits to attract people away from Facebook and all that type of thing, right? So they're provided in a competitive sense, and they're benchmarked against their peers. So I guess where we're going with this is that the cost of providing these employee benefits is very significant, and we'll talk about that in some detail in a minute. But some of these products, like medical, as we're looking at this slide here, are you know, represent 80% of a company's total global spend of non-pension employee benefits. They're escalating at something like 10% compound per year, and again, we'll show you the statistics on that in a minute. But if that continues in the sense that the cost of providing these benefits is doubling every 10 years, it's going to get to a point where CFOs and CEOs are going to go, well, this is just too expensive to become sustainable, and it will put the provision of those benefits under pressure. So, you know, notwithstanding the important thing of doing the right thing anyway, and on employee engagement, like we talked about in the last point, taking a stance here on addressing some of the issues is very important from a financial perspective. So if we look at the next slide here, what we wanted to do, you know, I guess Ruth and Dennis, our experts, have talked about the wellbeing trends, and we wanted to share how some of these are presenting in terms of the insurable employee benefits side of things. So we've talked about some statistics already, but, you know, looking at the three, this again is a UK example of disability and life insurance claims. I think we've talked about healthcare, and we'll go back to healthcare in a minute, but I think it's also important to consider the impact of other insurable employee benefits, and in this case disability, and one stat on life insurance. So I guess in totality, we're looking at three claims causes here, and again, these are UK statistics. So we've got mental health, musculoskeletal, and cancer, and in totality, these three account for 65% of all disability claims in the UK. That's good in a sense from a positive perspective, because if you think about the 80-20 rule, it's very convenient in terms of prioritizing these issues and being able to focus on each one of those and sort of consider tools and strategies to address them. I guess, you know, the other thing to point out here is that actually none of those three, even though they equate for 65% of the total disability claims causes in the UK, none of those three are actually mutually exclusive. So I think Ruth used an example of stress leading to anxiety and being a precursor to other things as well. And that you know, using that example, if you're stressed all the time, you're tense. You know, compound that with working from home and having a poor setup, that's going to cause musculoskeletal issues. Similarly, if you're stressed all the time or you've got anxiety, that potentially can lead to cancer as well. So, you know, these are issues and they're measured independently, but actually they're not mutually exclusive. They're collectively exhaustive in their approach. So, to point that out. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to give you a bit of a warning that it's an extremely busy slide, and I kind of apologise for that. And there's some maths involved in it as well, but our intention is a good one. So we wanted to try to help you as risk managers, I guess, quantify the cost for your own business of some of these things, right? So on the left-hand side of this slide, we can see an example, a real example of an anonymised customer and their global medical spend. So in 2020, this customer globally is spending about $67 million US dollars on providing medical or healthcare for their employees. In the orange, that is showing an escalating figure over a 10-year period, and basically that escalation is exclusively related to general inflation. And I think when we did these slides maybe a couple of years ago, the inflation rate was higher. It's probably come off since then, but it is a global average inflation rate. And then what we can see in the blue on the top there, where we see it peaks at $139 million in 10 years time, is the difference between orange and blue. The orange being the general inflation rate and the cost of medical increasing in line with general inflation, and blue being the explicit cost of what is called medical inflation. And medical inflation is the general cost of services, drugs, technology, awareness, I guess, of benefit provision, and the increasing cost of that. So the combination of general inflation, I think we had it as 5.2% here. Again, it's probably high. Combined with medical inflation is combining at 7.6% here in this example. And you know, plugging those figures in over a 10-year period, we can see that the cost of providing these benefits for this particular company is going to double, more than double over that 10-year period, right? So you can see it goes back to the point about not having, or these benefits not being provided on a sustainable basis. The blue bit is the encouraging point, though. That's where we can actually take action, like Ruth and Dennis are talking about, and some of the strategies we're considering. That's what you can impact. It's around all of those points around medical inflation is what we can address. So that's the good news story. And then on the right hand side of this slide, we won't go into now, but these slides will be available to you afterwards. I won't go through the maths, but basically it's the calculation there of looking at how you calculate medical inflation, or the cost of, I guess, making your own orange and blue chart on the left for your own organisation based on UK based employees. So you plug in the number of employees. We've got the average cost of providing medical insurance there in the UK, the medical inflation rate for the UK. We've also got the global medical inflation rate if you wanted to look at something globally. And then the example at the bottom there is, I guess, based on 1,000 employees in the UK and what that looks like and the impact over a 10-year period. So, but again, that's just the UK, and then obviously if you work for multinational organisations, that's going to be a multiplication factor depending on the number of countries that you're in, and I guess the richness of benefits that are provided in those countries. So if we can jump to the next slide, please. So we've already talked about a number of, I think Ruth and Dennis have talked about a number of things that we can do to help address these issues and bring down that medical inflation rate and sort of the claims cost and disability as well. And I guess some of the things that we wanted to talk about, you know, they're big bag, they cost a lot of money, and they're big investment for an organisation. And I guess we'll talk about that in a second in terms of how we can get to a stage that we can business case these ideas with HR, with the finance teams, with procurement, and look to address them. But some of the actions we can take are actually very cost effective and don't take much effort really at all. So I think, you know, an example of that might be, to Dennis's point about a decline in physical activity, that might be encouraging physical activity. So maybe you create a health hour once or twice a week where employees are given free rein, encouraged to go out and go for walks or runs or whatever they want to do. It might be a bit more of an expensive option of providing subsidised gym membership or similar type of initiatives like that. I think it's important for all these things that you get senior management buy-in, and there's some role modelling going on there at an exec level. A couple of Zurich examples that we've done for our own employees in the UK is some investment in low cost tools. So we use a tool called Nudge, which is a financial education tool. It gives you, it prompts you to look at different things. There's seasonality around it. So if it's coming up for Christmas, it talks about, you know, debt of buying gifts and all that sort of stuff. And it's tailored to your own, you can tailor it to your own circumstances as well if you're interested in certain things like saving to children. And it's the idea of Nudge is to, I guess, take away some of the financial burden. Not all of us are geared towards finances and are good with money and stuff like that. So it's to relieve some of the financial stress. And one of the things that our benefits team pointed out to us when we were talking about Nudge is that actually the perceived cost of something like that is actually, you know, for an organisation like Zurich is very insignificant, but the benefit is perceived very, very positively by employees. So a small investment can equal a big payback or acknowledgement by employees. And likewise, I think, you know, if there's a huge cost for something, you expect a huge bang for your buck. That's not always the case. So a second example here is a virtual GP, and I know Dennis is an expert in this. In the UK, we use a service called Babylon, which is linked to our Bupa healthcare. And actually, that is very, very cost effective. It gets you pretty much instant, GP appointments, and addresses things that maybe people wouldn't go physically to the GP to see, but we're happy to talk to in a digital sense, have an audio or a FaceTime consultation with doctors. And again, the cost of that is pretty modest for an organisation, and the impact is quite strong, because what you're doing is you're, particularly in this sense where the pandemic we're in at the moment, you can't actually get out to see doctors, and it's a convenient way of doing that in a socially distanced way. But also, you know, people that might be more reluctant to go to see the doctor can do that in an efficient way, and it picks up conditions a lot earlier than it would do if you were physically going to see your GP, which is good, because the earlier you get involved and you address an issue, the easier it is to address that issue, and I guess cheaper in the sense of healthcare as well. The flip side of that is the longer you let something fester, the worse it is. And the more expensive it's going to cost. And one of the things that I guess the healthcare industry is concerned about from COVID is what we call the COVID bounce back factor. So, you know, medical healthcare costs have been suppressed to sort of between 60 and 80% of normal levels this year, and that's a global statistic. And actually going into next year, because people haven't been able to see their doctors, treat their conditions, we feel that there's going to be a bounce back factor that would at least equal, if not surpass, what the claims impact would have been in 2020. So we're expecting, embracing ourselves as an industry for that. The other thing that you can do in terms of trying to save, I guess, save money and have an impact is take a global view. If you're a multinational, I guess something that Zurich focuses on is, you know, globalizing, taking a global view, looking at an international program potentially for or procurement, purchasing employee benefits at a global level, or if you have a captive, using your captive to do that, and the captive can invest in these tools and business case some of the solutions we're talking about. And the last thing on this slide is just the emergence of data. We're getting some real rich data at a global level, particularly if you think about what Dennis's business do in terms of digital healthcare solutions, and the data that we're able to sort of get from that, which is almost like an early warning factor, is very, very rich. And delving into that sort of data with the help of professionals like brokers or consultants and insurance companies to help you understand the future impacts of what the data is telling us. I think in the interest of time, I might skip to that last slide if we can. So in terms of wrapping up and summarising, I think we've covered a lot of ground in a very short time this morning, and I know this is being recorded, so if it's a bit too overwhelming, then we've always got the opportunity to go back and look at it. And we've really, in terms of the subject matter, just covered the tip of the iceberg. I think for us, the 5 key takeaways are that, you know, the healthcare landscape is changing, costs are spiraling. We've just talked about a real life example of a customer whose global health or medical spend is going to double within 10 years if they don't do anything about it. They're passively managing that and don't address the medical trend. The second point here is around physical and mental well-being being intrinsically linked to each other, a healthy body, healthy mind. We've also considered that employee well-being is becoming a consideration for analysts because of the positive correlation between employee engagement and an organisation's profitability. So I think this becomes the norm, which we think it will. Then we're likely to see employee well-being on more CFOs' agendas, and we're seeing for the first time, I think last year, that there was the first well-being degree launched by I think it was Warwick University. So it's the professionalisation of well-being is probably linked to the financial importance of it as well. Point 3 there is engagement with HR is essential. So I don't think we've actually talked about this enough today, to be honest with you, but they're really the gatekeepers to your people within your organisations. And, you know, I think we've had feedback where we've done previous AMX sessions that HR sometimes think of risk managers as the police. Now, you can't do this, you must do that, follow this process. But actually, you know, considering your skill set in terms of risk management and to get their support, and importantly, budget from a CFO to do some of the things that we've talked about in terms of mitigating strategies, then, you know, your skill set is really there to help HR business case these issues, use maybe some financial tools to help put a return on investment calculator together, work with the CFO, with sourcing, procurement, colleagues. It's always a good way of moving this forward. So HR are amazing at what they do, but they don't tend to have the experience or the skill set or the inclination to put together business cases. So this is something that we think that you can really help them with and add some value. Point 4 is around risk management for HR people, or as we call it, HR risk management. It's crucial using your skill set to positively positively influence all the things that we've talked about today. It's an ideal way of partnering with HR. And finally, I think, as Ruth made the point, it's very important to acknowledge that the proactive and effective management of positive wellbeing and health promotion is the responsibility of everybody. It's not just an employer thing, it's about employees as well taking responsibility and engaging. And it's never been as important as it is today. So with that, I think I'll pause, and I think we might have some time for questions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Rob. And thank you, everybody, Dennis, Ruth, for what I think was an extremely informative and very timely timely workshop, especially at this time of year as we contemplate moving into January and what we can do to try and assess our workplace, especially our physical and mental health, and set resolutions for what we want to do going forward. Rob, quick question just to follow up on that there. I mean, you touched obviously on spiraling costs and some of the mitigation strategies, but if you had to pick just one or two of the top ways that you could mitigate those costs, I mean, what would you recommend as the centerpiece for trying to keep costs under control?
I think the first thing to do is to again, well, I think there's three things. One is engaging with a professional like a consultant to help you collate all of the data sources that you've got, get a real pulse and understanding of your own organization's issues. I mean, obviously pointed out sort of the three big issues, and they're probably going to be reasonably consistent for most organizations, but getting that data, understanding it for your own business, and then maybe again putting some numbers to that to help business case some of the solutions. I think that the second thing is, and it might actually lead on from the first point, is if you are a multinational organization taking a multinational approach to this, having a centralized approach to procurement, purchasing, things like global employee benefits, using your captive and stuff like that to be more efficient, around keeping those risks, keeping the premiums and profits within your own organization, and using that as a mechanism to springboard investment in some of the digital solutions like that Dennis provides, for instance. They're probably the two key factors.
Thank you. Right, we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. Ruth, I think this is probably a question for you, but someone has asked, in all honesty, do we believe that we're seeing a rise in mental health cases because of greater discussion around the issue and because greater ease of reporting, or is it actually a proliferation of mental health issues?
Oh, that's a great question. I think two things really. I think people are more willing to talk about it now than they were before. And as the generations come by, there is a focus to to make it normal part of health talk discussion to include mental health. I don't know that it's necessarily on the increase. I think it's just different. I mean, certainly we are recognizing that stress, people are juggling many more plates. People have much more responsibility perhaps than they once did. And living in these very uncertain times, stress is very much on the increase. So, also we've got to factor in at the moment that many people who are working feel lucky to have a job, and therefore they try to work harder than ever, and perhaps disguising some of the mental health issues as well. So I think, I think it's a combination of different factors, and it's multifaceted, not simple.
And do you think then that what we're seeing is the growing trends in mental health issues are going to be further escalating in the current environment we're living in, or do you think they'll eventually sort of plateau as we move back towards normality? It's a bit of a predictive question, but I think very vital. I'd love to have a crystal ball, but I don't. No. I do perceive at the moment, I think at the moment, whilst we're in the pandemic, it's definitely going to escalate. There's no two ways about it. And I think it's going to escalate and then reach a peak and then plateau. The problem is that the resources to deal with these things from a clinical perspective, I'm talking about the NHS services and private healthcare services, recruitment is a huge thing into those services to be able to deliver the support that is needed. So I think that there is going to be a rise, but I think it will plateau at some point. And I think what will happen, or what I'm hoping will happen, is that because everybody will start to take more responsibility for themselves, and employers and the professional services and the charitable organisations will start to work in more collaboration, then it will be a much more manageable affair, but we're predicting it to grow. Yes, in many ways, it calls for a sort of ERM approach across much of society, that you need public services, private services, and individuals and corporations to work hand in hand to combat that rise. But what you said just there about the issue of it being a lack of resource often, or the fact that resources are not appropriately deployed, I think that plays in nicely to a question that's come in from the audience. And I suspect, Dennis, this is probably a question directed for you, which is, are there ways, really effective ways, that we can use AI to prevent mental as well as metabolic illnesses where physical activity may be reduced? I suspect they're thinking of how we're all sort of living and working at home. I know certainly my physical activity has certainly tailored off, and my mental health has deteriorated considerably. Are there ways that we can sort of deploy new technologies and AI effectively to combat those?
Well, I think maybe there's two ways to look at that, and it's a really interesting angle on the issue. The one is, can we use them currently in the workplace? And I would think possibly not just right now, that I think a little bit too early in respect to their evolution and an application right now, but are there developing and emerging technologies which enable us to identify at-risk, high-risk or emerging risk individuals in the workplace? Absolutely correct. And there are some amazing biometric and psychometric tools and behavioral kind of surveillance tools which really are coming to the fore and identifying decompensating employees in the workplace, leveraging the power of AI in that process. So simple things like monitoring interaction and behavior with mobile devices, things like evaluating and correlating engagement and attendance data, and certain physical parameters in relation to annual or periodic assessments, really give organizations an incredibly rich data source and a clue into the potential for, as I mentioned, decompensation of employees in the workplace. Very few organizations are really using these, and I don't think that the legal context has actually caught up with the application of these in the workplace just yet. So there's a bit of a hornet's nest to navigate in that regard, but some very exciting tools nonetheless, and I think more and more relevant and applicable in the workplace over time.
And that's a very interesting question, I suppose, that I had never considered, which is, if one has the capability to monitor individual employees for health and activity and all that, what is the legal basis for doing so, unless you sign your life away, in some sort of
True story.
That's a very good question, that the legal basis hasn't caught up with the technological advancement.
Yep.
I'm afraid that we are out of time, which is good because we've exhausted the questions from the audience for the time being. But should there be any further questions from the group that you would either like to send directly to the presenters or through Airmic to them, please feel free to send them across to us. I think this has been, as I said, an extremely timely workshop, and the panel has excellent discussion. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Ruth, Rob, and Dennis, as well as Zurich, for stepping in for this workshop. And hopefully we will have you all back again very soon, because I suspect this issue is not going away. So thank you very much. And with that, I will close the workshop. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, such a pleasure.
You're welcome.